Good morning, and thank you for joining this online virtual service of the First Unitarian Church of Alton on this 14th day of March, 2021. I am Joy Heft, and I serve as a worship associate, and I'm also the pianist for this church. We are a small lay-led congregation located in Alton, Illinois, on the bluffs of the Mississippi River. Due to the pandemic, our services are now virtual. Past and present services can be found on our church YouTube channel. We hope to see you at our castle on the hill sometime soon, when we can return to worship together face to face. In the meantime, we welcome everyone to this virtual home of comfort, spirit, justice, and hope. We are Unitarian Universalists. This week, we'll start a series of services about Unitarian Universalist history and the people that help our faith. We begin our service with a prelude. If you have a candle nearby, please join me as I light my own and recite our unison words for the chalice lighting. We hallow this time together by kindling the lamp of our heritage. Please join me in singing our first hymn, Down the Ages We Have Trod. We offer the gentle reminder that this community of faith is supported only by your giving. We need each other, and in times of trial, we need each other even more. You can mail your gift to the First Unitarian Church, Post Office Box 494, Alton, Illinois 62002, or you can give electronically by searching for the First Unitarian Church of Alton on the Giblify app or via the link on our webpage. If you prefer, you can also give through PayPal. Give what you will, for you are a generous people. If you know it, please join me in our offering prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. Our reading today is number 566 in our hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, titled God is One, by Francis David and adapted by Richard Fuchs. In this world, there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation. You need not think alike to love alike. There must be knowledge in faith also. Sanctified reason is the lantern of faith. Religious reform can never be all at once, but gradually, step by step. If they offer something better, I will gladly learn. The most important spiritual function is conscience, the source of all spiritual joy and happiness. Conscience will not be quieted by anything less than truth and justice. We must accept God's truth in this lifetime. Salvation must be accomplished here on earth. God is indivisible. Ej Oj Isten. Today's service is the start of a series of services about the history of Unitarianism and Universalism. I basically grew up in the Unitarian Universalist faith, but I really didn't learn much about the history or the people who were involved. As an adult, I would hear the ministers give sermons and talks about people such as Theodore Parker, William Ellery Channing, or Jose Below, or any other prominent UU forefathers, and I had no idea who these men were or why they were so important. I think that learning something about the people and events in the past helps us connect with our history and move forward on our own spiritual journey. My hope is that learning about these events and people who helped bring Unitarianism and Universalism to us might help us understand where we came from and where we are heading. Since there is a lot of information to go through, this topic will be broken into several services which will be held once a month for the next few months. So keep a lookout for the next UU History service next month. Today we will start with a history from the early Christian church from the 3rd century to the 16th and 17th century in Europe. Unitarian Christianity is the belief in one God and can be traced back to the earliest days of the Christian church. Many theologians and Bible scholars affirm that in the earliest church, before the 4th century, most people believed in one God, and only a few believed in the concept of God being a tri-personal being. Some believed more or less what resembled modern Trinitarianism, while others took a quasi-Unitarian approach to the concept of the nature of God, trying to fashion out how to resolve the idea of how God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit could be described in personal terms in the Bible, yet there was only one God. Still, many others affirmed that God was one being, period. The first person to talk about is Origen Adamantius, who lived from 185 to 251 AD. He was a Greek scholar and an early Christian theologian of Universalism during the 3rd century. He taught that God and Jesus were separate and distinct divine beings, and that there was a pre-mortal existence of our spirit or souls. His teachings were controversial and contradicted the popular Bible interpretations of Paul. Origen Adamantius was widely regarded as the first great theologian of Christianity, but he was also considered a heretic. He was tortured and died a martyr, and was never made a saint. During the late 3rd and 4th century, believers could choose different ways of viewing their relationship between God and Jesus. There was a belief that Jesus was sent by God on a divine mission. Thus, the word Unitarian developed, meaning the oneness of God. Another choice of belief was universal salvation, which was the belief that no person could be condemned by God to eternal damnation. Universalists believed that all people would be saved. The third belief was that Jesus was the Son of God and sent to the people to save them from their sins, and that Jesus was a divine creature. This was the Trinitarian view. Aries of Alexandria lived from 250 to 336 AD. He was a trained priest from Egypt whose teachings gave rise to a theological doctrine known as Arianism during the 4th and 5th centuries. Aries was greatly influenced by the writings of Origen, however, they didn't agree about everything. Aries taught that although God the Son indeed pre-existed as a divine being before the creation of the universe, he was not co-eternal with God the Father. Reconstructing the life and doctrine of Arius has proven to be a difficult task, as none of his original writings survived after Emperor Constantine ordered their burning, and any that survived this purge were later destroyed by his orthodox opponents. Those works which have survived are quoted in the works of churchmen who denounced him as a heretic. Arianism, which was named after Arius, is a theology in which Christianity believes that the position of Jesus as Son of God was born a human. This belief was not a Trinitarian belief. For nearly 50 years, up until the 4th century, the Arian view of Jesus and God was the most prevalent view of religion in the land. Arianism is sometimes considered to be a form of Unitarian theology, as it stresses the unity of God at the expense of the notion of the Trinity. A quote by Arius: "If God and Christ were equal, then Christ should be called God's brother, not God's son." Arius taught that although God the Son indeed pre-existed as a divine being, he was not the same as God the Father, which drew outrage in the Church's belief in the contrasting belief that the Father and Son existed together with the Holy Spirit from the beginning. Arianism drew great controversy that divided the Roman Empire and defined the limits of Christian orthodoxy for centuries to come. The bitter disputes among popular church leaders led to mob violence and political turmoil, and thus Emperor Constantine was moved to convene the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325 AD. Constantine's hopes that Christianity would serve as a unifying force in the empire. Meanwhile, he became frustrated due to the continuing disputes between those who followed Arius and those who supported the current Christian church beliefs. By 325 AD, the Arian controversy had become significant enough that Constantine called an assembly of bishops to the First Council of Nicaea to settle the dispute between the bishops who supported Athanasius, who believed that Jesus was a divine being and part of God, and those who supported Aries of Alexandria, who held the belief that Jesus was a created being and not a god. In the end, the council condemned Arius and declared him a heretic. It was during this council that the document that would later become known as the Nicene Creed was drafted as a statement, and the acceptable and unacceptable views of the nature of God the Father and Jesus Christ. The Nicene Creed is still recited today in various Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, and some Protestant services. The Nicene Creed rejected the tenets of Arianism. Arius could not and did not accept this statement, so Constantine exiled him, as well as any bishops who signed the creed but would not condemn Arius. This did not put an end to the controversy, though. This creed made the statement of belief that God and Jesus were both divine. We believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, of one being with the Father. After Constantine's death in 337, an open dispute resumed again over the Nicene Creed. Eusebius, who had been made bishop of Constantinople, became an advisor to Constantine's son, Constantius, and then who was the emperor of the eastern half of the empire. Constantius encouraged the anti-Nicene groups and set out to revise the official creed itself through numerous church councils. He proceeded to exile the bishops adhering to the creed, including Athanasius, who fled to Rome. In 355, Constantius became the sole emperor of the whole region, and thus extended his pro-Arian policy to the western provinces. When the Bishop of Rome, Liberius, refused to sign a denunciation of Athanasius, Constantine forced him into exile for a period of 2 years. This was the first instance of a long struggle with the Roman Church, in which it would emerge, in its view, as a champion of orthodoxy in the face of royal error. The next emperor, Valens, continued Constantius's policy and supported the Arian party, exiling opposing bishops and often using force. Many of the Nicene bishops were exiled to the other ends of the empire. These actions, paradoxically, contributed to an understanding between the Western supporters of the Nicene Creed and the Eastern semi-Arians. At the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381 AD, years after Arius' death, a group of mainly Eastern bishops assembled and totally accepted the Nicene Creed. This was generally considered the end of Arianism among the non-Germanic people in the Roman Empire. At the close of this council, Theodosius issued an imperial decree ordering that any non-conforming churches would be turned over to pro-Nicene bishops. Trinitarianism officially won, even though in many areas of Europe and Asia still followed the Arian belief until the 6th and 7th centuries. It was then that rulers were then persuaded to adopt the Trinitarianism view of the mainstream church. From that time onward, until around the 16th century, Unitarianism, for all intents purposes, was dead. Please join me in singing our next hymn, number 23, Bring Many Names. next section is the 16th century and the people who reawakened Unitarianism in Europe. Miguel de Servet, or Servetus as he became to be known, lived from 1506 to 1553. He was a Spanish theologian, physician, and humanist. His interests include many sciences: astronomy, meteorology, geography, jurisprudence, the study of the Bible, mathematics, anatomy, and medicine. He was renowned in history in several of these fields, particularly in medicine and theology. He was another follower of Unitarianism. After his education in the Catholic priesthood, Servetus joined the Spanish court as a page in 1530. While there, he became outraged by the pomp and luxury displayed by the Pope and his retinue, and he decided to leave and follow the path of the Reformation. Servetus's anti-Trinitarian views developed after he came to the conclusion, from reading the Bible, that the doctrine of the Trinity, as defined at Nicaea and Constantinople, was not biblical at all, but political. He saw himself as leading a return to the simplicity and authenticity of the Gospels and of the early church fathers, who were Arians. In part, he hoped that the dismissal of the Trinitarian dogma would also make Christianity more appealing to Judaism and Islam, which had remained as strictly monotheistic religions. In 1531, Servetus published a work called On the Errors of the Trinity, which raised much controversy throughout Europe. In 1553, he continued to release other religious works, such as The Restoration of Christianity, that sharply rejected the idea of predestination and the idea that God had condemned souls to hell regardless of worth or merit. God, insisted Servetus, condemns no one who does not condemn himself through thought, word, or deed. To John Calvin, the leader of the Calvinist Church, who had written the fiery Institutes for Christian Religion, Servetus's latest book was a slap in the face. The irate Calvin sent a copy of his own book to Servetus as his reply. Servetus promptly returned it, including thoroughly annotated insulting observations. Calvin was furious at Servetus's bold rejection of Calvin's doctrine. In time, their correspondences grew more heated. Calvin developed a bitter hatred of Servetus because of his openly unorthodox views. John Calvin condemned Servetus for his views and vowed to have him jailed and killed for blasphemy. On February 16th in 1553, Servetus, while traveling in Vienna, was denounced as a heretic by William Tree, a rich merchant who was a very good friend of John Calvin's. Servetus was questioned and then released for lack of evidence. The next month, Calvin sent the correspondent letters between himself and Servetus to Tree. On April of 1553, Servetus again was denounced a heretic and was arrested by the Roman Catholic authorities, imprisoned, and put on trial in Vienna, France. He escaped from prison 3 days later and went into hiding. Meanwhile, during the trial in June, the French Inquisition trial convicted a missing Miguel Servetus and was sentenced to be burned with his books. Meaning to flee to Italy, Servetus stopped in Geneva, where Calvin and his reformers had denounced him the first time. On August 13th, Servetus attended a sermon by Calvin in Geneva. He was immediately recognized and arrested after the service, and was again imprisoned and had all his property confiscated. At this trial, Servetus was condemned on 2 counts: for spreading and preaching non-Trinitarianism and for refusing to believe in infant baptism. Nevertheless, the judge denounced his execution and became a harsh critic of Calvin due to the whole affair. Since Servetus was not a citizen of Geneva, and legally at worst, he could only be banished. The authorities consulted with other Swiss cantons, in which they generally favored his condemnation and execution. Most prominent Protestant reformers, saw Servetus as a dangerous radical, and the concept of religious freedom did not really exist yet. The Catholic world had imprisoned him and condemned him to death, which apparently made Calvin believe that Servetus was even more deserving of death on his account of his unconscionable blasphemies. Those who were against the idea of his execution, the party called Libertines, drew ire of much of Christendom. Servetus was sentenced to death by burning for denying the Trinity and infant baptism. When Calvin requested that Servetus be executed by decapitation rather than fire, Judge Farrell chided him for undue leniency, and the Geneva Council refused his request. Calvin continued to justify the use of harsh punishments, not only against Servetus, but against heretics in general. In another part of Europe, a Protestant Reformation took hold in the remote mountains of Transylvania during the 16th century. The Protestant Reformation in Europe was a major movement within Western Christianity that posed a religious and political challenge to the Catholic Church, including the papal authority. The Reformation brought about the awareness and concerns about what were perceived to be errors, abuses, and discrepancies by the Catholic Church. The first declaration of religious tolerance was declared in 1568 during the reign of the first and only Unitarian king, John Sigismund, who ruled for 12 years. King John Sigismund lived from 1540 to 1571 and ruled Transylvania from 1559 to 1571. He was the first Unitarian king who allowed religious tolerance in his country. He took the Reformation even further by supporting debates about religious tolerance in the 1560s. Along with his court physician, Giorgio Biandrata, who was familiar with Servetus's anti-Trinitarian writings, as well as being a supporter of the radical religious reform, and his court preacher, Francis de Vide, Sigismund concluded that people should be able to freely believe what they wanted to believe without any retribution. King Sigismund released the Edict of Torda in 1568, allowing religious freedom for everyone in Romania. This was only the case for another 3 years. In 1571, the king established equality for all 4 major religions: Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and Unitarian. Unfortunately, the very day after issuing this statement, King John Sigismund was killed in a hunting accident at the age of 30. That would prove to be the high water mark for Unitarianism during that time. From then on, Unitarianism would be persecuted and attacked once again, even though it would survive and flourish for another 450 years and counting. After King Sigismund's death, he was replaced by a Catholic king who demanded that everyone follow the Trinitarianism belief. King Sigismund approved of the statement of the Unitarian belief and the right to hold them and preach them. He then issued a statement strengthening his earlier proclamations of religious tolerance. In this new edict, reaffirmed, quote, that in every place the preacher shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to his understanding of it, and if the congregation likes it, well and good. If not, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied, but they shall be permitted to keep the preacher they prefer. And no one shall be made to suffer on account of his religion. And it is not permitted that anyone should threaten anyone else by imprisonment, for faith is the gift of God. End quote. There is much in the Edict of Torda that demonstrates our Unitarian traditions, which we continue to rely on today. The commitment of faith does not award royalties to governments or empires, but by the sacred and holy. That a free pulpit and free pews are necessary for religious freedom, for free religious communities. And even that the action of our commitment to resist authoritarianism as a religious practice was demonstrated in this statement. Francis de Vide lived from 1520 to 1579. He was King Sigismund's court preacher, who was the most responsible for establishing Unitarianism in Transylvania. After studying to be a Catholic priest, de Vide served as a rector of a church school and then as a parish priest. Influenced by Servetus's writings, he became a Lutheran and debated fiercely against the Calvinists. Being open to new theological ideas, de Vide once again resigned from the Lutheran Church and became a leader in the Reformed Church of the Calvinists. Transylvania in the early to mid-1500s was unique in its acceptance of religious tolerance. Young King Sigismund learned about Francis de Vide and appointed him as his preacher to his royal court and the bishop of the Reformed Church. As Servetus continued to study philosophy and theology, he began to question the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He was well versed in the Bible and knew that the concept of the Trinity was nowhere in the Scripture. He argued that God must be one, which became the slogan for the Unitarian movement in Romania. In Hungarian, Egy az Isten means literally, God is one. These ideas were not well received by other religious groups, but the king believed that religious disputes should be aired in public debates, and many of these were held over the next few years. The Unitarians never tried to establish supremacy for their beliefs, but merely the right to hold them and preach them. In 1568, de Vide wrote the following to King John Sigismund, quote, "There is no greater piece of folly than to try to exercise power over conscience and soul, both of which are subject only to their Creator." Shortly after this statement was issued, the king convened a religious synod at the palace, where for 10 days, nobles, ministers, and Francis de Vide debated about the doctrine of the Trinity. David de Vide did very well at debating for the Unitarianism, and he felt that it was a victory for them. From that day on in 1568, Francis de Vide preached about Unitarian beliefs and became bishop of the Unitarian churches in Kolesvar. De Vide was very influential in having the Diet of Torah released in 1568 and preached for the first time that people should have freedom of conscience and religious tolerance. After John Sigismund's death, he was replaced with a new king who was Catholic and was determined to stop the spread of Unitarianism. Many influential people attempted to try to keep de Vide quiet, including Fausto Sozzini, to avoid prosecution. But it was a matter of conscience, and he was not going to avoid prosecution. He was not going to change his preaching in order to save himself. David's last sermon was given at the church in Colisfort in 1579. In it, he warned the people about the repression that was coming and went on to defend the Unitarian doctrine fiercely. Francis David declared that worshiping Christ was no better than worshiping the Virgin Mary and the saints. Whatever the world may say, it must be sometime become clear that God is but one. A year after Sigismund's death in 1572, the new prince had Francis David arrested, tried as a heretic, and was found guilty for blasphemy. He was sentenced to be imprisoned in the castle at Diva in isolation. David's health was poor, and he did not think he would survive long in those conditions. Francis David died in prison in 1579. A Unitarian movement had begun. After the doctrinal debates, more and more Transylvanians became Unitarians, and within a few years, there were more than 300 Unitarian ministers serving congregations throughout Transylvania. David had argued that people should be allowed to choose among themselves to what faith they could believe. They had started something important, had struggled for religious tolerance in a time of great disorder. Francis David had demonstrated the importance of free and open discussion of religious ideas. David once wrote, "In this world, there have always been many opinions about faith and salvation. We do not need to think alike to love alike." Let's take a moment for meditation as we watch and listen to this Transylvania blessing as we remember Francis David using the phrase Ej Oj Isten, which translated means God is one. This video is from our teal hymnal Singing the Journey, number 1043, Zekeli Aldous, sung by the Virtual Sanctuary Choir from the First Unitarian Universalist Church in Houston.
Where there is God, there is
In other areas in Europe during the 16th century, more anti-Trinitarian thinkers became harsh critics of John Calvin because of the incident with Servetus, although they also became more cautious in expressing their views too, and either ceased writing or only wrote in private. Servetus's writing influenced the beginnings of another Unitarian movement in Poland, which led to the separation of the Polish Brethren, who were sometimes called Arians, from the Calvinist Reformed Church. They were a small but unique movement for their time and were most radical Reformed church in the Commonwealth. As Unitarians, they denounced the Trinity, believing that God was a single entity and Jesus was just a man. They stressed pacifism as one of the most important teachings coming from the Bible. The Polish Brethren were also extremely critical of feudalism and thus advocated for liberation of peasants from serfdom, universal health care, and universal educational system. During their time in Poland, the Polish Brethren were recognized as one of the most influential intellectuals in the Commonwealth, relevant not only in the country but also abroad. They laid the foundations for another movement, which helped foster the early Unitarian theology and laid the foundations for the Socinian movement during the mid-1500s, developed by Fausto and Lelio Sozzini. Fausto Sozzini lived from 1539 to 1604. He was an Italian theologian whose anti-Trinitarian theology was influential in the later development of Unitarian theology. Fausto was the nephew of Laelius Sozinus, who was also an anti-Trinitarian theologian. Fausto Sozzini had no formal religious training, but followed his uncle's beliefs in theology, and denounced the Roman Catholic doctrines early on. He was condemned at the Inquisition in 1559, whereafter he sought refuge until 1562. In 1558, he traveled to Transylvania, where he tried unsuccessfully to dissuade the Unitarian bishop Francis de Vede from his controversial renunciation of the worship of Christ to avoid his own demise. After that, he then took his reformed understanding of Christianity to Poland, where he attained dominant influence in the minor Reformed Church with the Polish Brethren, who would later form a church theology that would become to be known as Socinian. Socinianism is a system of Christian doctrine named for the Italians Laelius and Fausto Sozzini, uncle and nephew, respectively, which was developed among the Polish Brethren in the minor Reformed Church of Poland during the 16th and 17th centuries. This doctrine was embraced by the Unitarian Church of Transylvania during the same period, and is most famous for its non-Trinitarian Christology, but also contains a number of other unorthodox beliefs as well. Socinianism declares that all religious matters must be reconcilable with reason. Socinianism rejects the doctrine of the Trinity in favor of Unitarianism. They believed that Jesus was merely human and rejected the concept of the virgin birth. They also believed that only God knew the necessary truths in order to explain how man could retain his free will in light of a God all-knowing. The Socinians also held that humans were created mortal in the beginning and would have died naturally, whether Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree or not. The Socinians rejected the orthodox biblical doctrine, stating that the sacrifice of Christ must satisfy God's wrath towards his people, in favor of example theory of atonement. That Christ came not to save his people from their sins, but to make them savable, and the rest is up to these people. This doctrine was embraced by the Unitarian Church of Transylvania. During the rest of the 16th and 17th centuries, Unitarianism started to appear in scattered areas in Eastern Europe, even though many people still oppose the idea of choice in matters of religious faith. The direct doctrinal descendants of the original Socinians are the Unitarian Christians of Transylvania and England. Although the Polish Brethren never adopted the name Unitarian while in Poland, when they were disbanded in 1658, those who fled to Holland eventually embraced the term Unitarian. By 1676, there was at least 3 Socinian meeting houses in London, even if the Act of Tolerance of the 1689 saw Socinians and Catholics excluded from official recognition. Socinian theology, particularly in the doctrines of the person and work of Christ, continued to have a significant influence on the Unitarians in England during the 17th century. Please join me in singing hymn 352, Find a Stillness, in our Singing the Living Tradition hymnal. The melody and words for our last hymn come from Transylvania and were written by John Sigismund. I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for emails from the church office. They are the best way to keep up to date on announcements and updates at First Unitarian Church of Alton. You may also check out our website, newsletter, and Facebook page for other announcements. Please contact the church office if you have an event or announcements that you would like us to share via our weekly Church This Week email. Look out for next month's UU History Service, in which we will hear about Unitarians in England and Europe, as well as head to America with the beginnings of Unitarianism there. Next week, March 21st, we will be traveling virtually to visit Reverend Kleber Van Zandt of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Venice, Florida. His sermon title is No Longer Black and White. You will find the link to this service on the church's Facebook page and UU Friends. And now, if you have a lit candle or chalice near you, I invite you to join me in extinguishing the chalice. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. We just heard about our Unitarian forefathers from the 3rd century to the 17th century in Europe. Aries of Alexandria, Origen Adamantius, Miguel Servetus, a Unitarian King John Sigismund and his preacher Francis David, and the Socinians, who all believed in Unitarianism and who fought to keep it alive. Who would have thought that their history went back that far, and then to be cut short in the 6th and 17th centuries, but to be revived centuries later? As we know, that is not the end of our story. Look out for next month when I talk about Unitarianism in England during the 17th and 18th centuries, and then hop across the ocean to find out about the Unitarians in early America. We will now listen to our postlude. Our service is ended. Go now in peace.